Hello, and welcome to the February general meeting of the League of Women Voters of Champaign County. As you are aware, this year for our general meetings, we've been trying to focus on issues that have been making headlines at the national level and their implications for the citizens of Champaign County. For today's meeting, we have invited the County Clerk of Champaign County to talk a little bit about the issue of election security, which has come up on the national level with concerns about various things, and how that's handled in Champaign County. And the clerk has a presentation for us, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask him some questions. So thank you, and welcome, Mr. Hulten.
Thank you. It's good to be back. It's been a while since I've been here. I appreciate the invitation. And we can talk about anything you want today that's election related, and I will run through a couple of minutes on the various systems that we use and the ways that we secure them, the vulnerabilities that we think exist, that we think we've addressed. At any point that you want to interrupt with questions, we can wait till the end if you'd rather, if that makes it easier for the broadcast, or we can just make this more conversational if you'd like. So to start with, election administration in Illinois is very decentralized. We have what is called a bottom-up election system, which is rather unusual in the United States of America. The vast majority of states have a top-down, where there is a statewide election authority, and that statewide election authority has a much more direct administrative role in elections. In the state of Illinois, we have 109 different election jurisdictions. In most cases, elections are administered by a county clerk. But in several counties and cities, there are election commissions, which are appointed bodies that are the election authorities for their jurisdictions. Danville, for example, in the city, their elections are administered by the election commission of the city of Danville. Elections outside of the city of Danville in Vermilion County are administered by the county clerk. So there's this sort of strange hybrid system in Illinois as well. In Champaign County, I'm the election authority for the entire county. We do not have an election commission. Our office is 15 people, about $1 million in annual budgetary authority, and we are responsible for everything having to do with any sort of official election in Champaign County. In Champaign County, we have two systems, and again, this is generally true for most of the jurisdictions in the state of Illinois. Two systems that impact our elections. The first is our voter registration system, and that system contains all of the records for the 130,000 roughly registered voters that we have in Champaign County. That includes your name, your address, your gender, your birth date, the last four digits of your Social Security and or your driver's license or state ID number. It contains a digital copy of your signature. It contains your voting history and your absentee voting behavior and all of the records affiliated with you voting. That information is connected to the internet. We sync that database on a nightly basis to the State Board of Elections, and so therefore it must be connected to the internet on a persistent basis. Yes, ma'am.
How far does this go back?
The online voter registration system?
All of our names, everything. How far does that go back?
Once you're registered to vote in Champaign County, so the question is, and I'll repeat it for the folks on the broadcast, the question is how far back do our records go in terms of voter registration? And the answer to that is, how long has the longest registered voter been on the rolls in Champaign County without passing away? So if somebody registered to vote when they were 18 and their 18th birthday happened to be 100 years ago, if they've never left Champaign County and have never canceled their voter registration, we still have a voter registration record for them. The question is, does that include phone numbers? Champaign County, I believe, is the only county in the state of Illinois. Darlene just asked this question, actually. We do not include phone numbers in our voter registration database. This was a decision made by my predecessor. State law says that if we have phone numbers, we are required to release them to candidates and political committees. My predecessor decided that it would be better for voters in Champaign County if he deleted the phone numbers from the voter database.
From a lot of us pressuring him not to, it wasn't only him.
And it's been a decision that's not been without controversy, but most voters would tell you they appreciate the fact that it's a little bit more difficult for candidates and campaigns to get their phone numbers. It's certainly not impossible. I just got a phone call the other night from J.B. Pritzker for governor, which is interesting. He must have a really interesting database to put me on his list, but they do not get phone numbers from our database. The corollary to that, another question Darlene asked, was email addresses. We collect a lot of email addresses now in our office, and those are attached to voter registration records, but those are exempt. We are not required to release those to campaign committees, and so we do not. And so we use those in the office to communicate several times a year for election-related communications. The start of vote by mail, we will send an email to everyone for whom we have a voter registration email address and say, would you like to request your vote by mail ballot? We do that for the start of early voting. We do it for a reminder right before Election Day. But those email addresses are not accessible to any candidates or political committees, including my own when I'm a candidate. We use those only for election-related communications in accordance with the state law. So back to this voter registration system. We synchronize the voter registration system on a nightly basis to the State Board of Elections. We do that because statute requires us to, and because the State Board of Elections maintains a master list of voter registrations that they then compare across jurisdictions. So if Debbie Rugg is registered to vote in Champaign County and moves to Peoria County and registers to vote, the State Board of Elections can try to generate a match based on name, birth date, driver's license number or ID number, last four of your social security number. And so that if Debbie registers in Peoria County, we will get a notification in Champaign County to say, we have a potential match. You may want to investigate whether you should remove Debbie Rugg from the voter rolls in Champaign County because she has registered in Peoria County. We do on an ongoing basis, a lot of voter roll maintenance based on those sort of interstate matches. We also do intrastate matches. We do intrastate matches pretty regularly with State Board of Elections. We do interstate matches with about 27 other states right now. The State Board of Elections and the state of Illinois participate in two cross-state programs to do voter registration maintenance. One is called Crosscheck and is the subject of considerable controversy right now. One is called ERIC, Electronic Registration Information Center, which is very, very similar but subject to significantly less controversy. Both are useful to us in various ways. Neither is a purveyor of absolutely accurate information. If we get a match for Laurel Pressing from Indiana in Crosscheck, or whether we get it for Deb Busey in Missouri from ERIC, we still have manual investigation that we must do to make sure that that match is in fact a match before we would update anybody's voter registration based on it. Often that includes calling the other jurisdiction or emailing them in another state, asking for a digital copy of a signature to be emailed to us to make sure that the signature is in fact a match. So we do a considerable amount of voter registration roll maintenance based on that. That voter registration system, again, is connected to the internet. Everything that is connected to the internet is vulnerable to security breaches. In the state of Illinois, we were subjected to a breach in the summer of 2016. The State Board of Elections had a vulnerable web form on their website, and a hacker used a technique called a SQL injection and gained access to the state's master list of voter registrations. Their intent was unclear. They didn't alter records, which leads me personally, this is not the official belief, to believe it was more about identity theft than it was about election hacking. But they did access, I believe, tens of thousands of records across the state of Illinois, starting, interestingly enough, in the database with index number 1 and simply worked down the numbers of registered voters. The State Board of Elections handled the response to that hacking and contacted the voters affected, even the voters in Champaign County directly. So I don't have the list of voters in Champaign County that were affected by that State Board of Elections hack. No voter registrations were altered. It never had an impact on our voter registration database. No voters were removed from the rolls. No records were changed. But it did bring to the State Board of Elections and the state legislature an incredible awareness of the vulnerabilities of this statewide voter registration system. In the wake of that 2016 attack, very shortly thereafter, within a couple of weeks, we developed an ongoing relationship with the state police, with the Department of Homeland Security, and with some other security agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to both investigate that breach and develop best practices moving forward for how such a breach could be, if not avoided in the future, detected in the future, and a response generated. One of the things about election security when it comes to the voter registration database is it is online. There isn't anything we can do to make sure it is 100% hack-proof. As long as something is connected to the internet, it is vulnerable. And so we have tried to implement best practices in conjunction with Homeland Security and the FBI and the state police. We try to review those best practices as often as we can. We do weekly online reviews with the Department of Homeland Security, for example. But I don't want to lead anyone to believe that this could never happen again. It certainly could happen again, and in fact, it's probably likely to happen again, given the world that we live in these days. So we have focused on preventing to the best practice that we can. We have focused on detecting to the best of our abilities, and again, working with our security agency partners, and responding. So when we are breached, what is our response to that? How do we communicate to the folks who are affected? How do we make sure that the breach didn't affect any of the voter registration rolls in a way that could impact somebody's ability to vote at the next election? And how do we move forward, whether it's restoring a backup, and how do we move forward in the event that another attack occurs? So that is the voter registration system. Separate from that, and more importantly, is the voting system. The voting system itself is the actual tabulators and the ballots that those tabulators and the computers that program the tabulators create. The voting system itself in Champaign County and in most jurisdictions is not online. Our voting tabulators in Champaign County never, ever touch the internet, and they never touch a computer that touches the internet. And so that offline nature provides an inherent layer of security for us. If it's never connected to the internet, it's impossible for the Russians to tunnel in through the Ethernet connection and get to our voting systems. In fact, we maintain two Windows XP machines in our office that we use specifically to program those tabulators, program the memory cards that have the election definitions on them. Those Windows XP machines have never been connected to the internet, not even to run Windows Update, because we want to take that extra step to protect the security of those machines. So in that sense, our voting systems themselves, I believe, are very secure from the sort of hacking that generated this hysteria in 2016. It is certainly possible to hack election machines. If you've been interested, you can Google it and see the videos of, this MIT professor takes down this voting machine in 20 minutes and shows you how easily it's done. But in order to do that, they have to have access to the machines. They have to be plugged into them, for example, with a laptop and a network cable or a serial cable, or they have to somehow be able to gain physical or online access to the machines. Champaign County, they're not going to get online access to our machines. And if they try to gain physical access to our machines, I'm pretty sure our election judges would let us know, hey, Gordy, there's a guy who's standing in the corner of our polling place with a laptop plugged into the tabulator. He says he's from your office, but we don't recognize him. He didn't show ID. Obviously, we'll take steps to check on that. The other measure of security that we have in our voting systems, again, separate from our voter registrations, is that in Champaign County, we use all paper ballots. So if there is a problem with the programming on the voting machines themselves, we can always, at the end of the day, open the ballot box, pull out the paper ballots, look at them, put human eyes on them, and say, well, this is the number of ovals that were filled in for John Farney for auditor in November of 2016, and this is the number of ovals that were filled in for George Danos for auditor in 2016, and we can do a hand count to verify that our machines are counting accurately.
Do you ever spot check that?
We do. We are actually required to. My somewhat rumpled appearance this morning, I apologize for. We are doing our equipment testing right now, what is mandated in statute called a pretest. And what that means is we take every machine that is going to be used for this election and we feed into that machine a series of ballots that it would be expected to count. And we have, for that set of ballots, for a typical machine for this election, it's 32 ballots. We have, for those 32 ballots, an expected set of results. So when the machine counts these 32 ballots, it should generate this number of votes for this series of candidates in this sequence. We run those 32 ballots through the machine. We generate a tape from the machine, and we compare the results that we get from running those ballots through the machines to the expected results. And if they don't match, then we have a problem and we need to investigate it. Is the machine not counting accurately? Did we program the ballots or the database incorrectly? Is there something that we need to look into? We're 35% done with that equipment testing right now, and right now everything looks like everything is functioning absolutely as it should. But if we ever run into an error, then we are in plenty of time before the election that we can catch it. And again, we have paper ballots. Mm-hmm. That paper ballot is the ultimate layer of security in terms of the voting process to make sure that our machines are catching things that they should catch. Post-election, we're also required to do a 5% audit. The State Board of Elections will randomly select 5% of our machines, will notify us of those machines selected after the election. We will, again, open to the public and the media and candidates, and anyone can come. We will run through those selected machines the same ballots that they counted the first time. For early voting machines, it's the early voting ballots. for election day machines, it's the election day ballots, and compare the results generated from the retabulation to the original tabulation that was done as part of our unofficial results. And if there is a discrepancy, we have to report that to the State Board of Elections. We also report that on our website every election. Occasionally we do find discrepancies in our post-election audit. Most often that's because somebody has marked their ballot creatively. They will use a pencil and fade in their oval lightly, or they will have a pen that they are using to vote, and as they're voting they are sort of dragging it from oval to oval or making a pinprick pen mark inside of an oval, and the machines are incredibly accurate and incredibly sensitive, and if you fill in the oval for Laurel Pressing but you let your pen rest in the oval for whomever Laurel's opponent is, the machine may get confused and count that as an overvote sometimes. It may count that as a vote for Laurel sometimes, and so that can cause us some discrepancies. We have to document those, report them to the State Board of Elections, and we post them on our website. We will catch 1 or 2 discrepancies sometimes per election when we do a retabulation, and that retabulation for a big election can involve 5,000 or 6,000 ballots. For a small election, it can be a few hundred ballots. But we are required to do a post-election audit every election. So again, to summarize, we have 2 systems. Voter registration system, online and therefore vulnerable, and we're doing what we think are the best practices in terms of securing it. Second system is voting systems. Voting systems are offline, have a paper backup, and we have a greater deal of confidence in their security and their invulnerability to hacking because of their online nature and because we have paper ballot backups. So, questions?
Yes, I've heard that people can register one day and vote the next day.
Well, they can register on one day and vote that one day, all in one step.
Really?
In 10 minutes, yes. It's a relatively new law in Illinois. It is called election day registration or grace period registration. And what it requires is the voter to show up with ID, ID that we verify, driver's license, proof of address. They must be able to prove who they are and where they live. Those are the 2 key pieces we need. They register to vote and they can vote all in one step.
But how can you assure that they haven't registered someplace else? Maybe they're voting 2 or 3 places.
We are working on a system right now where when somebody registers to vote and wants to vote at the same time, we attempt to query the State Board of Elections system to see if they have a pending ballot request in another jurisdiction. But again, our database is synced to the State Board of Elections on State Board of Elections on a nightly basis, not in real time. So there is a vulnerability. What I will tell you is that we do every election a post-election audit, where we compare our records to the other jurisdictions where we share voter registration records and see if we can identify potential cases of double voting. We have 19 cases that we sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for the Central District of Illinois for the 2016 general election. That's the first election where we saw some possible instances of double voting that we thought were so worthy of investigation we sent them to the FBI. The FBI has had those now for more than a year. And despite my repeated attempts to get some feedback from them on what they're doing about it, I've gotten essentially no response from them. So we've had cases of potential double voting in the past that we've been able to investigate, and in the vast majority of those cases, it has been a mistake by an election judge. And most of you have served as election judges, so this is not to throw you under the bus, but you know it's a busy day. And when Bill Williams Jr. comes in to vote, sometimes you pull the ballot application for Bill Williams Sr., and Bill Williams Jr. signs for Bill Williams Sr., and then when Bill Williams Sr. comes in, you look at the record, or Bill Williams Sr. doesn't vote, but let's say Bill Williams Jr. or Bill Williams Sr. is registered in Chicago, but Jr. signed for the record here in Champaign County, so it looks like Bill Williams has voted here and voted in Chicago. We can do a signature comparison again and see if we think it's an actual case of double voting. I've investigated a dozen cases like that in the 7 years I've been county clerk, and they've all been mistakes by an election worker. And you know, we have a human element to our election administration, and people make mistakes, and we gather that. But I have not yet seen ironclad evidence of a case of double voting involving Champaign County, with the caveat that we have some pending investigations. So.
I have a question with regards to the administrative staff for the elections. In particular, do you have security checks for these folks?
What do you mean?
FBI checks?
Do we do background checks for the employees hired in our office? We do not.
It's not required by law?
No.
Okay.
I don't know if it was 2014, but there was an election where in a couple of precincts, a vote for a candidate was more than the number of voters. So have you resolved that question?
We had some issues in the March 2014 primary related to the programming of our ballots, and those issues have all been resolved. Yes, ma'am?
Could you talk a little bit about the controversy related to cross-check, the pros and cons?
Yes. A cross-check, again, is one of two interstate voter registration comparison systems that the State Board of Elections uses. Cross-check is significantly older than ERIC. Cross-check is controversial right now, in my opinion, for no good reason whatsoever. It is controversial because it is administered by the state of Kansas, and the Secretary of State of the state of Kansas is a gentleman named Chris Kobach, and Chris Kobach is the co-chair of Donald Trump's now defunct Presidential Commission on Voter Fraud. And because Mr. Kobach is controversial, his office's administration of cross-check then became controversial, for no good reason whatsoever, in my opinion. It is but a tool for election authorities to use to compare voter registration records. It's not a voter disenfranchisement tool. It's not this grand conspiracy between 28 states to deliberately remove otherwise eligible voters from the voter rolls. Especially in Illinois, where we have election day registration. Somebody can literally show up on election day, register, and vote in the same steps. So in our case, that transaction is among the least efficient transactions that we perform with a customer, with a voter, which we consider customers. Election day registration is very slow. It's very cumbersome. It requires a lot of election judges who in many cases have only had 4 hours of training. And so what we try to do in Champaign County is make sure we have as many people on our voter registration rolls who are eligible as possible. Election day registration creates a disincentive for us to remove people from the voter registration rolls who would otherwise be eligible, because what we're doing is we're forcing them to do election day registration, which is a slow, inefficient, and cumbersome process for us with some security vulnerabilities. So this notion that somehow cross-check is being used to deliberately remove otherwise eligible voters from the voter rolls is honestly just a political controversy that's been ginned up because people are opposed to the gentleman who administers it. Like everything else in election administration these days, it's subject to paranoid conspiracies that somehow it's being used to benefit one party or the other, when in reality it's just been a tool we've used for 10 years or more.
So you've been using these tabulators for a while, obviously, if you program them out of a Windows XP machine. I know that there's talk that there will need to be additional tabulators purchased. Are we going to continue on this technology level, or do you foresee us having to move to a more advanced technology, and is that going to make keeping things separate harder?
I'm county clerk for 9 more months, and so I'm not going to make a decision about election equipment moving forward. Hopefully I'll be in a position to assist the next county clerk in making that decision. What we've done in Champaign County is we have two different models of tabulators that are both manufactured by a company called ES&S, Election Systems and Software out of Omaha.
What is it called?
ES&S.
ES&S, okay.
They are one of a handful of vendors that are approved and federally certified to provide election equipment in Illinois. The selection of the equipment was made with a significant amount of public input by my predecessor, and once an election authority starts to use a manufacturer's election equipment, it's very, very difficult and very expensive to switch. We are generally pretty happy with the ES&S tabulators that we have. The older model, right now our oldest models were manufactured in 2002 to 2004, purchased in 2005, and it's now 2018, so they are 13 to 15 years old. They have a nominal shelf life of 20 years. They are still functioning for us relatively well, but we are increasingly having to cannibalize parts from machines that go down in order to keep the machines that are alive still functioning. So we have 126 M100 tabulators in our inventory, of which only 10 or so are completely dead, but we're down to about 20 spares for our 96 election day voting locations. And what we've tried to do in our office is, for the last several years, in odd years in Illinois, we generally only have one election or maybe 1.5 elections, and so we occasionally will have some surplus election administration money in our county clerk budget. We have been using that money to gradually acquire a newer model of tabulator called a DS200. And if you voted early, the DS200 has a bigger touch screen, it's a much brighter screen, it's more reassuring to voters in terms of their warnings that they can potentially get for their ballot. We've acquired 16 of those gradually over the 7 years that I've been county clerk. We use those for early voting locations right now. They are easier to program to handle ballots from every precinct in the county, so we use them for the early voting locations, which are universal voting locations. And now we've started to use them on election day at those locations as well. So we have tried to come up with a gradual capital replacement plan for our election equipment here. But I will tell you that the big picture is election equipment across the country was all purchased around the same time that we purchased ours. The Bush-Gore election happened in 2000. Everybody looked at Florida and said, I can't believe we run elections this way, how embarrassing. The federal government got involved with something called the Help America Vote Act, and the federal government did what the federal government is wont to do, which is come up with a laundry list of requirements for local election administration and then throw a bunch of money at the problem. So the Help America Vote Act says that to conduct a federal election, you must do X, Y, and Z, including you must use election equipment that has been certified by the Federal Election Assistance Commission. In order to help you acquire that equipment, we're going to block grant money to the states, and then the State Board of Election block granted money.
That's an unusual part, that they give money along.
They did it once. So the problem is they did that block grant once in 2004, and every election jurisdiction in the country all bought equipment at the same time, and it's all dying all at the same time, and the federal government is not in the business of providing funding for replacement election equipment, and doesn't look like they're going to be for some time. So every election jurisdiction in the country is doing the same thing that we're doing. They're staring at a rapidly aging set of equipment and trying to figure out how they can afford to replace it. For us, one election day tabulator and ballot box is a $6,500 proposition. And so to replace our roughly 100 voting locations and have enough spares, we're looking at, in the neighborhood of $600,000 to $750,000. Champaign County doesn't have that money. We're broke. And God forbid, Douglas County or Piatt County, a county that doesn't have the resources that we have, they're facing the same thing that we have. We've tried to gradually accommodate for that over the years. And we've got a plan, hopefully, to continue to do that. But in terms of whole-scale changes or replacement of our election equipment, that was a decision that has some urgency, but it is still at least several years away. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious about the voter registration through the state.
The online voter registration through the State Board of Elections?
No, when the automatic voter registration that just went in the first of this year, I believe.
So there was a new piece of legislation in the state of Illinois that is an automatic voter registration bill. Parts of it were to take effect January 1st. The vast bulk of it will take effect this summer or beyond, even after the November election. The theory of it is that when somebody has an interaction with a state agency, and that state agency is able to verify the things that the person needs in order to be able to register to vote, including citizenship, birth date, address, identity, those sorts of things, that would generate a voter registration application routed to us through the State Board of Elections electronically, unless the voter proactively opts out.
Okay, that's what I was curious about, how it gets to you from the
County clerks had some input into the legislation, thankfully. Thank you to my friends in the legislature who gave us input, and one of our requirements was that the information be routed to us electronically in a fashion as similar as possible to the way that we are receiving online voter registrations from the State Board of Elections.
Okay, good.
So we will get a digital signature. We will get electronic confirmation of the voter's address, name, ID number, those sorts of things. So.
Is there any possibility that the 216 hacking was from the Russian hacking that we know about?
I don't know if they've identified a country of origin. I think the strong suspicion in the law enforcement community is that it was Russian, but again, I don't know that there's been any conclusion as to what the motive was. I don't know that the FBI has concluded that it was designed to steal data for identity theft purposes. I don't know, which is my hunch, or whether it was designed to try to alter the voter registration database to create some chaos in the election system. Again, they didn't alter anything. They had access to some records, including some personal information for some voters, so that's why my hunch is that this was about identity theft, not a national or state actor attempting to influence an election.
I have a couple quick questions. One, this winter, when there was a vote for a representative, I believe, to Congress, and there was a question about a ballot, and the ballot had a crossed off, when they actually looked at the ballot, that was the question to try to be the tiebreaker, or to
In Illinois?
no, another state.
Okay.
But they had a crossed off, they had a candidate marked, but they also had something they'd crossed off. And it was my thought, when we were teaching people how to vote, that would ruin your ballot, that it would get disqualified. And when the election group looked at it, they said, well, we know the clear intent of the voter. It is a tie. You know, they accepted the ballot. What do you guys do?
So we went through a 27,000 vote recount after the November election. The county auditor's race was a 37 or a 38 vote margin out of 93,000 ballots cast. So we did a 27,000 vote recount, which was my first recount in 7 years, and it was incredibly educating. And we saw ballots marked in every conceivable way. And when you make marks outside of the ovals on your ballots, the machines are designed to look for marks in the ovals. If you make a mark outside the oval, the machine is not necessarily trained to look for it, but occasionally it will pick it up and it will reject your ballot and say, you've spoiled your ballot, go get a new one from the election judge. But depending on where you put those marks, the machine may miss them. And if somebody fills in the oval, for example, for John Farney for auditor, crosses out John Farney's name, and then fills in the oval for George Danos, without knowing the sequence that those behaviors were engaged in by the voter, it's pretty hard to look at that ballot 2 weeks later and determine what the intent of the voter was. You might say that they crossed out Farney's name because they intended to vote for Danos, but maybe they filled in the oval for Farney. And so we rely on the machines. And when we did the recount, we were fortunate that over 27,000 votes, the margin of the separation across those precincts for those 27,000 votes did not change. The machines generally count incredibly consistently.
Good.
And if they're not, it's because of some goofy, in my experience, some goofy thing that a voter's done.
The other question is, and then I'll give the mic back to Holly here. You said, we have all the different 109 or 104, whatever, different. But then what is the role of the State Board of Elections?
The State Board of Elections is the state election authority. So when we have, for example, what we're going to have in 2018, where we have an election where we are electing state officials and federal officials, the State Board of Elections aggregates results from us, audits them, and certifies those results. The State Board of Elections also engages in best practices with us as election authorities, provides guidance for candidates, accepts petitions and other filings for folks who are running for state and federal office in the state of Illinois, tests and certifies election equipment. So the ES&S equipment that we use not only went through a series of federal tests, but they went through a series of state tests. The State Board of Elections will randomly select a handful of jurisdictions every election and actually come into the jurisdiction and conduct pre-election testing for the jurisdiction as a way of auditing pre-election testing procedures. We've had that happen to us once. Incredibly interesting to watch their testing procedures versus our testing procedures. So they're generally best practices, but not legal oversight.
Gordy?
Yes.
I respect you too much and the time of everyone in the audience to go back to a controversy that really won't be resolved, which is the ERIC system versus cross-check.
Sure.
But there is something there I want to revisit.
Okay, I'm happy to.
Before I do that, I want to say that what we have in common, and everyone in the room, is the absolute thrill of taking part in the election system. And I'm thinking of how I feel when I get up at 2 o'clock in the morning on the day that I'm going to go to the polling place and be a judge, or be a poll watcher, or be a deputy registrar. It's an utter thrill, and I'm gobsmacked, really, to be. We're all partners in this system. But about ERIC and cross-check, I'm going to ask you for some advice.
Okay.
But then before I do that, I also want you to comment on, are you not concerned about the flaws that have allowed Social Security numbers of so many people in Kansas to be exposed?
Oh, absolutely. But I'm also not under the illusion that any system where we are required to share data online is ever going to have that happen. I'm certain there are security vulnerabilities in our systems despite our best practices to try and secure them. And yes, there have been some high profile controversies about the security systems at Crosscheck, but again, I believe those controversies are only reaching our attention because of the gentleman who has been in charge of the program.
Okay. Well, there's some things about which we will simply not agree. So
Sure.
Accepting that, if I wanted to have not Crosscheck, but ERIC be the system that's used in my state, I should focus on Jesse White, the Secretary of State, or on my members of the General Assembly, my senators and representatives, or how would I succeed in ditching Crosscheck and adopting ERIC?
So there's a legislative proposal right now to force the State Board of Elections to withdraw from its intergovernmental agreement in which it participates with Crosscheck. Our Illinois' participation in ERIC is because of a different state law. So the legislature told the State Board of Elections, you will enter a compact with ERIC and you will administer it in such and such a fashion. And the State Board of Elections, in fact, even went beyond what ERIC requires. ERIC requires the State Board of Elections to generate data about, for example, folks for whom they have data but are not registered to vote, and requires us to make a contact to those folks within a certain number of days. That's what the contract with ERIC requires. State law requires us to automatically make changes to their voter registration based on matches within ERIC. So it goes a step further than what the normal ERIC agreement is from state to state. So if we get an ERIC match, we are required to update your voter registration. If I get a Crosscheck match, I'm not. I'm required to do an investigation, but I'm not going to automatically remove Laurel Pressing just because we get a match for a name and a birth date and no other identifying information for another voter in Indiana. Crosscheck is useful to us because of the states that participate in it. Indiana participates in Crosscheck, ERIC does not. We obviously have a lot of cross-border movement between Champaign County voters and Indiana voters, and the counties that are right on the border have even more. If we withdraw fully from Crosscheck, we lose a tool. And not a perfect tool, but a tool. There are no perfect tools in election administration. So,
I have a question about a reference you made to best practices to protect the voter registration information that you sent via the internet to update it.
yes, ma'am.
Could you sketch those out?
Without getting into an enormous amount of technical detail, we partner with the Department of Homeland Security, and they scan all of our outward-facing servers on a weekly basis and report to us with a list of what they consider to be vulnerabilities. And then they make recommendations to us if they find what they think is a potential vulnerability for how we can repair it. They update their scanning procedures regularly, and so as they update their scanning procedures for what they consider to be new vulnerabilities, we are then able to update our forward-facing servers that contain that information to try to address those vulnerabilities. Forward-facing meaning we have machines in our office that only our office can see. We have machines in our office that the State Board of Elections can see, and so we call those forward-facing or outward-facing because they are connected to the outside world. Yes. So we partner with Homeland Security to scan those machines to address the vulnerabilities that the Department of Homeland Security thinks are relevant, and then we try to address the vulnerabilities if any are found. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, my follow-up question would be, have you found them? Have you found Homeland Security to be responsive?
Oh, yes.
To answer quickly.
In fact, on election days, for example, we will have a shared statewide electronic chat room where election authorities can log in and say, hey, we're seeing this in terms of our system and we think it's weird. And there are folks from the state police and the FBI and Homeland Security who are in that chat room with us monitoring the State Board election systems and able to tunnel into our system and provide monitoring to us if we need it. We're on a regular email communication with representatives from those agencies. They've come to our conferences, our statewide conferences of county clerks and election authorities to present to us best practices, to build relationships with us so that we can be responsive. Yeah, we've found them since the 2016 incident to be incredibly responsive.
I've never voted by mail, but it's interesting to me. If I go to my polling place and I vote and I put it in the tabulator, I'm positive that my vote is counted. If I vote by mail and I just send it, how can I be sure that it doesn't get lost somewhere? Is that ever a problem?
It's obviously a concern for real voters, or a real concern for voters. What we do in the county clerk's office is we provide order tracking, for lack of a better term, on our website. So when you request a vote by mail ballot, we're going to try and collect an email address from you. But even if we don't, you can log into our website, check your voter record, and check the status of your vote by mail ballot. So let's say you requested your vote by mail ballot on December 20th, which was the first day. If you log in on December 25th, it's going to tell you the only thing we have in our system from you is a request. 40 days before the election, when we mail the ballots, your status for your ballot will be updated to say that we have mailed it to you. If you don't get it, you can contact us. Once you have sent it back to us, you can track to see when we receive it. Once we receive it, you can check to see when it has been tabulated. And if we, for whatever reason, reject a vote by mail ballot, which does happen very rarely, most often because a signature provided by the voter on the certification envelope doesn't match the voter registration signature we have on file, we are required to notify you. If it happens well in advance of the election, we'll send you a letter, or we'll email you if we have an email address. If it happens very closely to the election, we will attempt to try and call you if we can track down a phone number. If you've never tried voting by mail, you should try it. The folks who do very rarely go back to voting in the traditional way. And our vote by mail numbers and early voting numbers in Champaign County have escalated exponentially to the point for the November 2016 election, almost half of our votes were cast by voters other than on election day. And voting by mail and early voting is much more efficient for us. And if you vote early or vote by mail, you never have to worry about standing in line on election day. You never have to worry about your polling place being closed by a power outage or weather. I personally have made it my tradition to be the first voter in Champaign County for every election. And I do that to reinforce to people that if you're ready to vote, get it out of the way. It's less stress for you, and it removes an element of stress from the voting process on election day. Shortens lines for everybody else and makes the election judge's job easier.
I confess I've stood in line to vote early, but
People will
maybe
stand
going
in-
over lunchtime is not the best bet.
And people will stand in line to vote early without uttering a complaint. But if there's a 10-minute wait on election day, Katie barred the door, they're calling the county clerk's office. So
I know there is a concern, excuse me, by the students at the university about not having more sites to vote. I don't know if you want to do a quick summary, if there's such a thing as a quick summary for that.
Sure. So in Champaign County, first of all, we have greater access to early voting than any other jurisdiction in the state of Illinois. We run multiple early voting locations. We run them for at least a week each. And the ratio that we have of early voting locations and hours to the number of registered voters we have provides us with a unique amount of resources for folks who want to vote early. The controversy on campus has occurred because the legislature, in their infinite wisdom, has scheduled the March primary election for spring break for the University of Illinois, and which in Champaign County means it's spring break for most of our area school districts. We were aware of that when we came up with our early voting schedule, so we are open for early voting in our office now. So if you are ready to vote, come vote. Darlene has, a number of you may have already. We start that process 40 days prior to election day, and then we expand to 8 or 9 other locations around the county, usually a week, sometimes 2 weeks prior to election day, depending on the amount of traffic that we anticipate. And again, we want you to vote early. Every voter who votes early makes our life easier. It's a more efficient use of our resources. We have done, I think, a significant amount of encouragement over the years to encourage people to vote early. This election on campus 4 years ago, we ran an early voting location in the Illini Union for a week prior to election day, which is the same schedule we're running this year, in the Illini Union in roughly the same location. That week drew 190 total voters to the Illini Union early voting location. When we prepare for an upcoming election, we look at the most recent comparable election. For the 2018 primary, we're looking at the 2014 primary, and so we try to do an apples-to-apples comparison. We are aware that people think that there is significantly more interest in this election than there was 4 years ago. We're also aware of statistics that show us that when somebody votes early once, they're more likely to vote early in the future. So we are prepared to handle significantly more traffic than 190 voters in our Illini Union early voting location, but we do not at this point anticipate traffic that is going to be so significant that it will overwhelm that location. We can handle several thousand voters in that location. The Illini Union is uniquely identified in statute, in state law, as the one location on campus that is accessible to every voter on the University of Illinois campus, and we are required, in fact, to have an early voting location there. We run that early voting location for more days and more hours than state law requires us to. And we are opening it at 10 o'clock in the morning on the Tuesday before spring break starts. So they've got 10 to 6 on Tuesday, 10 to 6 Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. They got 32 hours before spring break starts. Then we've got weekend hours and hours all the way through Election Day, which may not be useful if you're leaving town for spring break, but there certainly is a significant window of opportunity for folks to take advantage of that. And there is a history of those campus area precincts of not having tens of thousands of people vote in this election. And we have to balance our desire to provide maximum convenience to everyone in terms of their voting with the scarce resources that we have in terms of Champaign County. And we have also demonstrated in the past that when we anticipate the demand for it, we will open additional early voting locations. We did it on the west side of Champaign at the Leonard Recreation Center. We did it on campus for the 2016 presidential election. So again, this is one of those controversies that I think is erupting because everything having to do with elections these days is controversial. But in terms of the metrics we track, our voter registration activity does not show a significant amount of increase from 2014. In fact, it's far, far reduced from what it was in 2016. Our early voting numbers are in the office are about what we expected. Our vote by mail numbers are through the roof. But that is, again, I think a residual of the fact that when people vote by mail the first time, they're very likely to do so again.
Are you talking total county or are you talking state?
Total county. Our vote by mail numbers are through the roof. But when you look into the data of who has requested a vote by mail ballot, it's folks who were likely to vote in this election anyway. They're folks who have a regular voting history. They're not brand new registered voters who are voting by mail, which to us would indicate an unanticipated surge in turnout. So in terms of all the metrics that we track, this primary election looks like it's going to be pretty typical. And so the notion that we have to open a second or a third, which was requested, early voting location on campus for an election that the last time we had it featured a grand total of 190 votes cast, including early votes, vote by mail, and election day across 10 precincts on campus, to me was not a prudent use of resources. So.
I'm just trying to phrase this correctly because it is just a question using your expertise, because it's clear that this county takes very seriously the notion of duplicate voter registration and really looks into that. Is the issue with cross-check in other places that there are county clerks who are pretty capricious or offhanded about just simply getting rid of a voter's name because it happens to match up with another name without doing any checking? I mean, is that possible on the part of a clerk?
Well, anything's possible. I've heard that allegation made, but I have no knowledge to be able to speak to it. I've not audited the voter registration list maintenance procedures in Tippecanoe County, Indiana, for example, so I don't know how they use cross-check as a tool. I can tell you from our perspective in Champaign County, it has been a useful tool for us, but we're very careful in how we use it, as we are careful with all of the tools that we use to maintain our voter registration lists. So.
Okay, we're a relatively small county in terms of area and population.
10th largest in the state of Illinois, as I like to remind our
Okay.
friends in Sangamon County, because they are the 11th largest in Illinois.
Okay, I assume Cook County is the largest.
Yes.
How is that organized? Do they have different commissioners? Is it split up some way or another? Because it's so big.
The city of Chicago has a board of election commissioners, much like Danville does, that is responsible for election administration in the city of Chicago, and then the Cook County clerk is responsible for elections in the county of Cook outside the city of Chicago, so the suburban townships. So it is divided, and the Cook County clerk's office will tell you that that's a wise division of labor, that a 3 million voter election jurisdiction is awfully large. So. Yes, ma'am.
How do you let the people on campus know about the early voting at the Illini Union?
So the University of Illinois is required by law to send an email to every student that they have an email address for prior to every general primary and general election, letting them know how to register to vote, how to vote by mail, how to vote early, how to vote election day. The university, I believe, sent that out a week ago. Our office also sends, as I said, an email for every voter for whom we have an email address. As you would imagine, we have more email addresses for younger voters who are more likely to vote online than we do for older voters. So that hits a disproportionately larger number of university students. We also mail, in partnership with the County Administrative Services Division, a postcard called 3 Ways to Vote, modeled after some other jurisdictions. We send that postcard to everyone who is ever voted early, ever voted by mail, and or newly registered to vote since 2008, which at this point would include everybody on the University of Illinois campus. So they get that postcard. It will hit next week, well in advance of the start of early voting at the Illini Union, and it will explain to them the schedule and locations for early voting, how to request a vote by mail ballot, including online options if they'd like to request a vote by mail ballot, and then what their election day polling place is if they want to vote on election day. We do that every election. The April consolidated election, we did it. Well, sorry, we didn't do it for the February primary. We do it for every countywide election, I guess is. And so we communicate that. We also do as much as we can in terms of social media and earned media to get the word out. We talk to the Daily Illini and our partners in the media. I try to get on WGPU as much as I can, but I'm not sure how many people listen to it anymore. So.
Any other questions? I have one more.
Yes, ma'am.
So this is perhaps an unfair question, but are there any security concerns that you have? Because you see more of the day-to-day election management than anybody else. Are there things you see that worry you?
Absolutely, but given the requirements that we have, and I think they're prudent requirements, to attempt to synchronize our data with other jurisdictions in various ways, the fact that we have to do that and want to do that creates vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities are, of course, concerns. But again, we have to weigh using modern technology in a way to administer our elections as efficiently as possible with the vulnerabilities that modern technology creates for us. And that's a trade-off. So we have to be very cognizant, again, about trying to prevent, trying to detect, and how do we respond when there is an intrusion.
Well, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Next month's meeting will be here, and we will have our Observer Corps reporting out on the activities of our various public commissions. And then the month after that, we will have a presentation on sustainable energy and the various impacts of that in our community. Thank you so much.